Chamber of Screams tribunal session. Water filled Mara de Soto's mouth before she could shape a single word. She coughed, and the sound came ragged and raw. Fear tightened her jaw and made her fingers clamp the leather strap beneath the bench. Domingo Alvarez stood with his palms folded over the iron rosary, watching the water drip from the clay pitcher. Brother Esteban bent over parchment, quill poised, and wrote the torn phrases that the tribunal demanded. The tribunal's problem was concrete. A confession was needed on an exact date, and a name must be produced under oath. That need decided every action in the chamber. Mara had not been allowed a lawyer, a witness, or a priest of her choosing. She had a sling of bruises, a burnt patch on her forearm, and a scrap of a prayer cloth tucked into her sleeve that she pressed with one trembling hand. The first sentences of the session spelled the immediate stakes. Domingo's voice cut the air. "Name him." He tapped his fingertips on the wooden table and did not wait for an answer. Mara choked and tried to pull her head back. Esteban's quill scratched as if time itself were measured in ink. Mara had been taken from a narrow lane 3 nights earlier. She had been flagged by a neighbor's accusation and carried by men who smelled of vinegar and cold iron. In the holding cell, her ribs had begun to ache where a strap had dug into her side. She had once traded bread for work at a textile stall. The tribunal had no interest in that history. The present required names, dates, and a stigma. Domingo's method was exact and ritual. He alternated the water with a quiet question, then a small kindness, then a tighter knot. Esteban kept the ledger open and wrote each altered breath as if transcribing scripture. The chamber smelled of wet stone, old wax, and the iron tang that clung to Domingo's fingers. When the pitcher tilted, Mara's eyes rolled with the fluid. She swallowed air and tasted metal. "Name him." Domingo again. His voice did not rise. It landed. "Name the man who spoke against the faith." He looked at Esteban and the scribe nodded once, a tiny, mechanized gesture. Mara spat. I don't know his name," she said. Her voice was thin and broke on the last syllable. She avoided Domingo's eyes. She counted the knots on the strap with the pads of her fingers to keep from thinking of being cut. Domingo walked the tribunal platform like a magistrate who walked a chessboard. He selected a single torch, held it so the flame etched the prisoner's face, and then stepped back into shadow. He spoke of punishment as if reading a ledger. He mentioned the exact punishment the chart required for her alleged offense. Esteban's quill made a final flourish and folded the paper inward. After the session, the chamber emptied to a narrow scribe alcove where Esteban was ordered to blot and rewrite. Domingo leaned over the table and traced a seal with the thumb of his glove. "Change this line," he said. He tapped a word and his fingertip pressed the ink into the vellum. The ledger was designed to be legible only from his angle. Esteban moved methodically. He blotted, held the page under the lamp, and scraped a thin crescent of scraped ink free with a knife. He did not look at Mara when he passed by the holding cells. He had learned how to make himself small in the tribunal's light. When the door closed and the corridor swallowed the torchlight, Esteban hesitated, fingers stalling over a folded scrap of parchment. He slid that scrap into the sleeve of his habit, where ink had long ago stained the cuff. Mara slept in fits and woke to the memory of water in her mouth. Fear shifted in her to something else. Suspicion tasted of stale bread and cold stone. She had seen the seal pressed into the ledger. She had seen Domingo's ring. She had watched a hand trace a line and watched Esteban write it down. The shift in her thinking came like a movement of the hands of a clock. Slow, precise, patient. She began to test the limits of the words she could say without being struck again. At the corridor outside the scriptorium, Esteban paused beneath a torch and folded the scrap into a palm-sized square. He pressed the fold with his thumb and read the single name and a date. His breath left him and he swallowed hard. Doubt moved across his face and then tightened into a decision. He had recorded the tribunal's work for years to survive. That ledger protected him, but the scrap altered survival into complicity. Esteban reached the holding cell and slid the scrap through the iron bars. Mara turned the paper over with shaking fingers. The name was not one of the men from the lane. It bore the household mark of Domingo Sohn's steward and a date that did not match the day she had been seized. The scrap changed the session into a fabrication. It suggested the tribunal invented confessions to cover more precise goals. "Brother Esteban," Mara said in a whisper that the damp corridor swallowed. "Who wrote this?" She pressed the scrap to her palm and thumbed the seal. Esteban's hands trembled. He kept his voice low. "I wrote only what they ordered." He did not look at her. He had ink between his fingers and a small cut along the left knuckle. "Hide it." "Keep the fold." He slipped a second, copied folio from inside his robe and slid it across the bars into her hand. The copy was a small, messy thing, but it contained lines that proved Domingo's hand. Esteban cleared his throat. "This ledger is being used to redirect blame," he said. "Names are erased, others substituted. I can show you where the words were not a cry. They were a mechanic's utterance, an inventory." A demonstration followed on the tribunal platform. Domingo brought a new prisoner onto the bench. He staged the second interrogation as a lesson. The man was neither strong nor young. Domingo's questions were softer at first, then mechanical. He spoke of mercy in an even cadence, then tightened a strap. He made a show of stepping away, of offering water, then returned with a small, insulting reprimand. The prisoner broke where the first had not. He named a merchant, an absent brother, and finally, when Domingo leaned close and hissed the consequence of refusal, he named a member of Domingo's own household. Esteban recorded the breakdown with his thin spectacles sliding down his nose. He wrote each syllable and each tear like marks on a tally. Esteban met Mara's eyes from across the room and passed a look that was not apology. It was a warning and a plea. "Do not speak of the ledger until you can be certain," he mouthed, and then he bent to his parchment again. The demonstration had shown how quickly the tribunal could reframe confession into evidence. Late under a torch's small halo, Mara held the copied folio and traced the signature with the pad of her thumb. She watched the ink and the pattern of the seal until the letters blurred. Confusion shifted into a cold clarity. The name on the scrap meant the tribunal manufactured guilt to hide appointments, to protect promotions, to erase names that threatened the Inquisitor's control. Mara did not speak of escape. She lacked the strength. Instead, she spoke of preservation. She pressed the scrap against the inside of her dress and promised herself a single, narrow task. Keep the name alive. That determination tightened her spine. It was not grand. It was tactical. She would survive this session and guard the folded folio. Esteban returned to the scribe alcove with his hands smelling of wax. He was commanded to blot a page and apply the iron seal. Domingo watched as if inspecting a dish. "Make it so the ledger reads clean," he ordered. "No loose lines. No stray witnesses." Esteban's fingers moved obediently but slower than necessary. He paused, then scraped at a blot with a knife and folded the freshly sealed page toward him. In the tribunal platform's sudden hush, Esteban made a choice that the ledger could not record. While blotted ink dried beneath the lamp, he slipped a copied folio into his satchel. He folded it flat against the vellum and wrapped it in cloth. The motion was small, practiced, mechanical. It fit into years of handwriting. He had friends who remembered small things, names, faces, and the exact grade of the rope used to bind prisoners. This paper would be one of those things. Domingo noticed nothing until Esteban bowed and carried the ledger. He smiled once, a small, satisfied line that tightened his cheek scar. He rang a small bell on the table, and the tribunal rose as if from a single body. "Court is adjourned," he said. And he turned to the corridor with his keys jangling at his waist. The sound of brass on leather was like a final punctuation that closed the day's record. At midnight, in the narrow stairwell beside the scriptorium, Mara and Esteban recognized the same pattern in separate ways. She had seen the seal and read the name. He had copied the folio and felt the ledger sly. They spoke in whispers that were clipped by fear and measured by calculation. Domingo sets the names where he needs them, Esteban, pressing his back to the cold stone. He hides favors and erases debts. He masks who the tribunal hunts and who it spares. His voice was dry and without flourish. Mara swallowed. She pressed her palm to the place on her temple where a pale scar lived. "Can we prove it?" she asked. Esteban answered with a slow shake of his head, and then, before he could let doubt root, he said, "I will keep a copy. Hide it. If you survive the next session, the copy will matter." The line was precise and brutal in its simplicity. They were interrupted by a sudden clatter from the scriptorium. A tray overturned, the metallic ring of seals scattering across stone. A lantern guttered. Someone elsewhere had dropped a torch. The external event pushed each heart into a quickened beat and forced a new choice. Mara slid the scrap deeper into her sleeve. Esteban returned to the ledger table and obeyed an order to reseal the page with his wax stamp. He set his spectacles and arranged pages with manic precision. In public he conformed, in private he acted. He closed one loop while opening another. The tribunal's climax came under torchlight, where accusation met its counter. Esteban stepped forward and placed the folded scrap on the ledger as if returning an errant note. He removed his quill and spoke, voice low but steady. "Domingo," he said, "the record shows an inconsistency." He set the scrap between the book's leaves so that the seal's pattern faced up. Domingo's face closed like a door. He looked at Esteban's hand and then at the scrap. For a moment the room had nothing but the sound of oil in wicks and the drip of water from a pitcher. Domingo's jaw tightened. "What inconsistency?" he asked slowly. Esteban met his gaze and did not flinch. "This folio shows entries that contradict the public ledger," he said. "Names removed and replaced. Dates shifted. A household mark appears where none should be." He set his palm on the paper and did not withdraw it. Domingo's answer was not words of reason. He rose and signaled for Mara to be returned to the bench. He blew out a candle with a smooth breath and stepped back into the dark that swallowed the platform. The decision turned a private accusation into immediate danger for Mara. The chamber rearranged itself. Men closed ranks. Torches were angled to strip shadow from faces. The tribunal's machinery began to grind louder, then focused on a single purpose: demonstration of authority. Domingo ordered harsher measures. A rope was tightened. A leather strap scraped once as it was passed across the bench. Esteban's face, lit by a single torch, showed an abrupt shift. His hesitation at the scribe table hardened into a visible regret. He moved to the ledger, hand shaking slightly, and blotted an entry under Domingo's command while inwardly calculating how to preserve his copied folio. The scribe's moral shift ran from fear to something like resolve. He did not act to stop the punishment. He acted to hide evidence. Mara felt the strap drag across her skin. Her breath shortened. She started to speak and then swallowed. "Mara," Domingo softly, and the single use of her name was a blade that shaped the space between them. She tasted salt and iron, and the memory of the scrap pressed hard into her palm. In the struggle that followed, there were 3 rapid exchanges of words. "Domingo, confess the names now." "Esteban, the ledger proves otherwise." "Domingo, seal the page." "Obey." The lines were short and sharp, and they moved the room like a series of locks being turned. Esteban's forced blotting took place under everyone's eyes. He resealed pages, rewrote phrases, and produced a clean set of entries that matched Domingo's command. Yet in the sleeve of his habit the copied folio lay flat and secret. He bowed to authority and then slid his hand into his satchel when no one watched. When the session finally broke, Mara was led away bruised, throat raw, but alive. She limped to the patchwork of blood and dried water along her jaw. Esteban folded his fingers as if to hide the paper and walked to the scribe alcove, where he hid the copied folio inside a leather satchel among quills and wax seals. In the undercroft and the damp outer corridor, they exchanged one last compacted conversation. "Keep the name Esteban. If you can move, go to the woman who sells boiled beans at dawn. She will know a man who will carry notes. His voice was a tool. It planned steps rather than promises. Mara pressed the folded scrap into her chest beneath her patched dress. Her shoulders hunched against the damp. Her fear had not vanished. It had altered into guarded hope and a battered stubbornness that would not be spoken of in grand terms. It translated into the single act she could perform: hide the name, survive the next session, and keep the ledger's copy intact. Outside, someone shut an iron door with a long final groan. The sound sealed that night's record. Esteban walked back to his desk and laid a hand on the vellum as if to bless it. He had become a quiet conspirator. He had not saved anyone yet, but he had started a ledger that might one day be evidence. The chapter's small closure was concrete and edged. Mara's wrists had new marks. Esteban had the copied folio. Domingo had secured a temporary victory by forcing public compliance. The corridor held the smell of candle wax and the slight metallic scent of fear carried from the bench. A single torch guttered as the guard on duty moved to secure the outer gate. The light steadied, and the chapter closed on action. Esteban sliding his hand into his satchel, Domingo turning his keys, and Mara being led away with a hidden name pressed to her ribs. Emotion root, fear, emotion shifts, fear, suspicion, resolve, doubt, compliance, clandestine hope. These feelings drove Mara's choices and Esteban's small betrayals. They were expressed in tightened hands, stilled breaths, and the decision to hide a piece of paper. The ledger's pages would lie clean in public. In private, names lived folded in cloth. The chapter ends not with a general thought, but with a concrete beat. The iron gate slammed. Esteban breathed once and slid the copied folio deeper into his satchel, and Mara stepped into the gloom with the scrap against her heart, the scribe's choice. Brother Esteban crouched over the scriptorium table and froze when his thumb brushed wet ink along a crossed-out name. Suspicion tightened his voice before he could speak. He said nothing and snuffed the candle with steady fingers. He lifted the torn page and saw the water halo, a smear that wiped letters toward blankness. The page smelled of vellum and the faint metallic tang he had grown used to in the tribunal. The scent of iron keys and damp stone. The immediate problem sat before him. Names were being erased, and the ledger was the courtroom's memory. He had to decide whether memory itself would survive his hands. Esteban had not intended to search in the dark. He had come back to blot a line and copy a testimony for the morning record. The scriptorium alcove had been quiet. The other candles out, the slate floor cold beneath his knees. He had worked this ward of books since boyhood and knew the ledger's spine like the shape of his own palm. The ledger belonged to the tribunal, and the tribunal belonged to Domingo Alvarez. Knowing that made the wet smear a threat as much as a clue. When he stood, the hairs at the nape of his neck prickled. He folded the torn edge between his fingers and found the name beneath the stain. He recognized the handwriting, an official clerk's hand, not his own. A second sheet tucked inside bore a different stroke, smaller and hurried. He placed both pieces inside his habit and walked the stone stairs back toward the bench, each step a decision. At the tribunal bench, a chamber guard was taking down torches. Domingo Alvarez arranged his rosary over his palm and watched the man move with practiced, patient cold. Esteban drew the corner of his habit across his mouth and kept his jaw rigid. He did not speak until Domingo glanced his way. Esteban, Domingo, voice even, you return late. Ledger work, Esteban answered, and kept his head down. His hands smelled of ink. The smell tightened the knot in his throat and moved suspicion into a quickened pace. He imagined names lost in damp blotches, thin voices erased by water. That image pushed him forward. Mara de Soto was brought in shortly after, wrists bound with frayed rope, hair clumped at her temple where a burn had been wrapped with bandage. The bench creaked when she was pulled across it. The tribunal chamber filled with a hush that always followed the arrival of an accused soul. Faces turned, breath lowered, the ritual readiness to watch pain do its work. Domingo tapped the ledger with a finger and pushed it to Esteban. "Prepare the page," he said. "She must sign." Esteban's fingers closed around the ledger at a place he had not yet marked. The torn page lay folded within his sleeve. He felt the ledger's weight like a hinge. He opened it, found the creased place where names had been crossed, and a freshwater stain darkened the margin. The problem became explicit before the entire chamber. The ledger decided who would be remembered, and who the tribunal would pretend had never been accused. Mara tried to speak when Domingo her name. Water from the earlier session had left a rasp in her voice. Her hands trembled beneath the rope. She Domingo and coughed until the sound broke. Fear and the ritual pressure of the bench pushed her towards silence. The crowd leaned in. Esteban felt their eyes as a physical weight on his back. Esteban lifted his pen. He had practiced clear hand for years. The clerk's strokes on this page were a ledger's steady architecture. He hesitated. Suspicion hardened into dread as he read a marginal notation. An official practice listed, and a name crossed out with an added smear of water. The smear matched the torn page in his habit. He folded his hands and made a choice he would later replay in ink. Smeared sleep. Instead of placing the ledger where Domingo had pointed, Esteban placed it on his knee and turned a page. His delay was a small, concrete action that moved the chamber's momentum. Domingo's eyes narrowed. Esteban Domingo, tapping once, read the charge. Esteban set his lips around the dry taste of candle smoke and read the formal entry aloud. His voice was soft. He read the accusation, the method of interrogation, the procedural line the tribunal used to secure a certification of confession. He read the names listed and hesitated at the place where another hand had struck through one name and rubbed the letters nearly away. When Esteban reached the crossed-out entry, he could not simply skip it. He lifted the torn page from his sleeve and let it fall onto the ledger like a folded finger pointing. He read aloud the name that had been rubbed toward oblivion. The chamber inhaled as one body. "Why is that name crossed out?" a guard demanded. Domingo rose with slow grace. "Silence," he said. His voice did not waver, but the word carried iron. The ritual had rules, and the ledger was the instrument of those rules. Esteban felt the second emotion shift. The dread that began as suspicion crystallized into open fear when a cloaked attendant at the back of the chamber moved toward the doorway. The attendant's steps were a small external event, but it changed everything. He whispered to a man in a hood, who then crossed the floor and touched Domingo's sleeve. Domingo's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed the iron rosary, and his shadow sharpened against the stone. "Bring the page," Domingo ordered. "Read out what you found, Esteban." Esteban's voice steadied by will. He read the ledger entry again, this time including the marginal notation that named a hidden practice of water during testimony and a list of suppressed victims. His mouth formed the sentences trained into him by duty, yet each word now carried the weight of accusation. The chamber's ritual order strained. As he read, Mara's hands twisted on the bench. She had heard the name read, and her eyes found Esteban's with a sudden, raw focus. She mouthed a syllable without sound, and then gestured with a trembling finger toward the ledger. Esteban answered with motion. He pushed the torn page across the table toward her, where the candlelight made the wet ink glisten. "Mara Domingo low." "Sign the page." She swiveled, the rope biting. Her lips moved. "I did not," she tried, then a cough-off cut the line. She spat and a little water dripped onto the bench. The smell of iron lifted from the wet ring. Her refusal, interrupted by coughs, turned the ritual into an argument. Domingo's patience broke into action. He leaned over her. "Sign it, Mara," he said, "or the ledger will decide for you." A rapid exchange followed, short lines that tightened like a noose. Esteban spoke first. "Domingo Esteban, the ledger shows erased names. There are witnesses noted." Esteban, Domingo returned. "You are the scribe. Keep the record." "Those names were crossed out," Esteban pressed. "They were vanished from the roll. Someone used water to blur them." Domingo's hand rose. You will not make a spectacle in my court. Domingo, Esteban again, voice firmer. I read what I found. The exchange was the chapter's first confrontation, 3 quick rounds. It forced a new choice onto Esteban. Defy the ritual by preserving the page, or obey Domingo and submit to the erasure. The chamber waited. From his position, Esteban could see 2 directions. Follow the ledger's duty to the tribunal and keep writing the official lie, or protect the torn page and risk the tribunal's wrath. The second emotion shift came again, fear bent toward resolve. His hands trembled but did not release the page. Esteban slid a small folded marginal note from his robe and passed it beneath the bench to Mara. The note contained a copied name and a smear of original ink, small, concrete proof. Esteban did not speak as he did it. The action itself carried his meaning. The note moved between them like a whisper. A cloaked attendant near the door saw the movement. He straightened and walked to the bench with easy, practiced speed. He did not shout. He only touched the ledger with a gauntleted finger, testing its weight. The attendant's arrival created another external event and a tightened pressure in the room. Who gave that to her? The attendant asked. Esteban's throat closed. He looked at Domingo. He looked at Mara. The moment became urgent. The chamber required a decision now, not later. Esteban knew how the tribunal punished acts that broke ritual. He also knew the ledger's page could kill names twice. Once under torturous confession, once beneath a clerk's neat erasure. Esteban did not flinch. Instead, he turned a page and began to read an older entry, a perfunctory line about procedures and times. His motion bought seconds. He felt betrayal thin along his tongue, and with it a bitter clarity. Preserving truth would not protect him, but erasing truth would make him complicit. He had moved from suspicion to dread to resolve. "Read the names you copied," someone in the crowd called. Esteban reached into his robe and produced the marginal fold. He held it up so the torches picked out the ink. For the first time since he had become the court scribe, he performed an act with the explicit intent to expose. He read the copied line aloud. The name, the town, and the date of arrest. When he said the suppressed victim's name, a murmur ran through the chamber like wind through dry leaves. Domingo's face did not change, his jaw flexed. He moved to snatch the ledger. A brief scuffle began, hands on paper, fingers in quills. Domingo's men pushed forward. Esteban felt a sharp pain as a guard's elbow struck his ribs. He did not scream. He swallowed the pain because shouting would surrender the page. In the rush, Brother Esteban made a decision that would define the rest of the night. He tore a second page with his fingers, creating a false entry he had prepared earlier as a shield, and shoved it toward Domingo's hand. The falsified sheet carried plausible charges and an altered signature. Esteban had crafted it over days, anticipating the ledger's demand for order. "Take that, Esteban, seal it. Burn the fragment if you must." Domingo stared at the sheet for a slow second. Then he set his hand on the ledger and pushed the falsified page into the spine. He spoke once to the guard at his side. "Remove her, Domingo. Hold her until dawn." Mara's shoulders hunched, and she looked from Esteban to Domingo. Her lips formed a short line of thanks without sound. Esteban understood instantly. The falsified page was a bargain, a quick trade for a life. He had offered the tribunal an acceptable narrative to bury the truth and bought Mara a fragile reprieve. Esteban led Mara away from the bench with his hand at the small of her back, guiding her past the guard. Her breath came in shallow, punctuated pulls. She leaned on him as much for balance as for trust. The third emotion shift moved inside him now. Resolve softened into guilt braided with relief. His fingers left ink on her sleeve where they had brushed. In the scriptorium back stair, Predon gloom pooled like a slow spill. Esteban took the torn original ledger page from where he had concealed it beneath his habit and slid it into the cavern beneath a loose flagstone. He pressed the stone down until the edges met and the page lay mute and cold. He did not wrap it. The act was precise. Place, press, leave, no grand words. No ritual. only a small physical burial of a manuscript meant to remember. Brother Esteban cleaned his fingertips with a scrap of cloth and felt the grain of the fabric catch the wet ink. He thought of the ledger as a machine that remembered some people and not others. He thought of Mara's throat and the way water had forced her to curve her mouth around false words. He replayed the earlier session, water filling her mouth until she could not shape a single sentence, and remembered how he had sat at the bench and moved his pen in time with the ritual. That memory had been sealed as canon. Now he had pried a seam. When he returned to the tribunal proper, the chamber had calmed to the same heavy quiet he had left. Domingo stood with his rosary in his hand and a falsified page pressed into the ledger spine. The guard handed him the ember of a torch, and it glowed low and steady. Esteban slid into his seat as if nothing had happened, but his hands still smelled of ink. Mara was taken to a side room. Before she was led away, she managed one short line. "Esteban," she said, voice thin, "thank you." He looked at her and did not reply aloud. He touched the back of her hand and felt the bones there. Her eyes were fixed on him in a way that did not ask for promises. She did not beg for change. She only needed a witness. After they left, Esteban lingered in the scriptorium. He read a formal line in the ledger to match the falsified page he had sacrificed. He wrote with exactitude, dates, formulas, signatures. His hand moved like a machine in service to survival. Each stroke was a compromise recorded in ink. That night, in the quiet of the alcove, Esteban folded a second slip and wrote out names he could not forget. Names he now committed to memory on paper and in mind. He sealed the folded note with wax and slipped it into the hem of his habit, where the original had been. He did not plan to show it to anyone, but the act of copying the names again felt like a future promise to resist erasure. An hour before dawn, a knock sounded at the scriptorium door. Esteban's body tightened. The knock was crisp and purposeful. He opened the door to find a cloaked woman with a small lantern. She did not introduce herself. She only handed him a scrap of parchment and passed on without turning. Esteban read the message by lantern light. A single name and a place, a warning to be careful. The name matched one of the suppressed entries he had just hidden. The message shifted the night's meaning. Someone else had noticed the erasures. The ledger's concealments were not private. The room filled with a new, small threat. A network of people who might risk exposure or demand it. He pressed the scrap into his palm and felt the rasp of its fiber. He remembered the ledger in the dark beneath the flagstone. He thought of the falsified entry he had given Domingo and of Mara's exhausted eyes. The emotional aftertaste settled. Guilt close to relief, suspicion leaning into cautious hope. The night's mini-conflict had resolved. Mara survived the session, but the larger problem remained. The tribunal still ruled, and a hidden ledger still existed. Before dawn, Esteban left the scriptorium and walked the narrow corridor that led toward the chapel. He adjusted his habit and the familiar tonsure prickled his skin. He breathed the cold hall air and felt the iron keys at the belt of the tribunal clerk he passed. He did not speak. He had hidden a page and given another. He had made a trade that preserved a life and broke a rule. That choice would read in the coming days like an ink mark on flesh. He had changed nothing in the structure of power. He had altered a record. The courage to name and the cowardice of the bargain lived together in his hands. He had taken a ledger that tried to forget people and given someone a reason to remember. The chapter closed with the practical beat of movement. Esteban slid the original page beneath the loose flagstone and left the chamber with ink on his palm and a ledger that would not disappear, ledger of drowned names. Mara slammed the warped door and stumbled into the archive, clutching a ledger whose pages still slithered damp under her fingers. Fear tightened the back of her throat and drove her forward. She could taste salt and ink on her tongue, and the memory of water filling her mouth the last time she had been on a bench. The ledger's lower corner bore the wet hallow brother Esteban had taught her to find, the same smear that had blurred a name in a tribunal record weeks before. She had come for names. The problem was simple and brutal. Names were vanishing from the records, and if the inquisitors finished their erasure tonight, the dead would lose even the trace of being counted. Mara moved past a shelf and pressed herself under a low torch, the ledger held against her chest as if it could still stop the light from touching the pages. She had been a witness in the tribunal. She had felt clay water poured into her mouth, had coughed while the strap bit into her wrists. Fear made her hands shake, but fear also made her certain those names had to be carried forward in ink or memory. In the narrow alcove she forced herself to breathe on the leather and check the torn edges. Her life, the list of those taken and branded, lived in those lines. She had not expected a second person in the archive. A shadow moved by the scriptorium table, and a hand came down on vellum before she could hide the ledger. Mare. Brother Esteban's voice was low and flat. He stood over the table with his spectacles pushed low, ink on his fingertips and a blotter under his palm. Mara froze with the ledger half turned. She did not step back. Esteban, she said. Her voice held a small, brittle edge. She forced the ledger into the torchlight so he could see the water hallow spreading across the page. Esteban crouched and put one ink-stained fingertip near the smear without touching it. He lowered his head and looked at the faint underlines. "You should not be here," he said. His hands moved with the same slow, habitual care he used to untangle parchment. The action showed agitation. His breath came tight at the seams. Fear shifted in Mara to suspicion. She checked his face for a flicker of alarm and found instead a crease at the bridge of his nose that suggested calculation. "They erased names from session 12, she said. "I saw it. They washed the letters away. I have to save what I could reach." Her jaw worked. She put the ledger on the table and opened to the stained section. Esteban picked up a quill and tapped the ledger's margin. "I know the smear," he said. "I saw it once. My thumb left an ink ring over a crossed-out name, and I could not tell why I hesitated then." He glanced at Mara without meeting her eyes. "If they are erasing names, they are erasing people. Whoever ordered it has a method and a list." Their exchange moved from accusation to planning in 3 short lines. "Then help me," Mara said. "Do you know how to bring them back?" She leaned forward. Her hands stopped trembling when the ledger's edge cut into her palm. Esteban's gaze flicked to the ledger, and he set the quill down with a practiced motion. "There are ink hallows and under ink. Heat or certain reagents can show what was written beneath the wash. I have no right to do more than copy. But copy I can do." He traced a faint line with a fingertip. "We will need time and a place without torches that report to Domingo." The name Domingo drew a different reaction from Mara. Anger, quick and sharp, she gripped the ledger. "Domingo is the one who watched the water drip from the clay pitcher when they sat me upon the bench," she said. Her voice dropped. "He will not look kindly on copies." Esteban lifted his shoulders. "I will copy what I can, but I will not risk pages I cannot hide. If Domingo suspects, we both lose the ledger and perhaps worse." Their plan had to be quick. Esteban produced a scrap of vellum and a thin candle stub taken from beneath his robe. He set the candle beside the ledger and said, "Show me the page you rescued." He crouched near her, and together they opened to a sheet where faint strokes blurred beneath a hallow. Mara set the ledger flat. Her fingers brushed old whip marks along her forearm as she steadied the page. The touch pulled at memory and fear. "My hands remember the bench. They remember the strap. I do not want them to remember these pages lost too." The sentence was a small, hard motion. She spoke it with the ledger between them like a confession. Esteban leaned in with a thin strip of metal he used as a warming plate. He held it near the page, careful to keep distance. Grey steam rose when a heated plate met damper vellum. Letters ghosted up from beneath the wash as the warmth coaxed the iron from the ink. Do not breathe over the letters. Your breath blurs the hallow. His voice had the monotone of a man who recorded, not who judged. Ink reappeared in faint lines. A name, a place, a notation. Esteban read it aloud as if he were cataloguing an inventory. Catalina Ruz, witness to confession. Crossed out, he let the name sit in the air. Why would they cross out a witness? Mara's mouth tightened, because a witness complicates a confession. Because evidence is dangerous when it points to them. She tapped the ledger where the letters had re-merged. We need to copy these now. They stayed bent over the ledger until the candle stub guttered. Esteban's hand moved with a dogged, steady rhythm as he copied names onto the scrap vellum while Mara held the candle and turned pages. They worked in silence except for the soft rasp of quill on paper and the slow drip of water from a misplaced jar. An external event arrived as required. Footsteps in the corridor, measured and certain. Mara froze and looked toward the archive entrance. "Someone comes," she whispered. She closed the ledger a fraction and hid the copied scrap beneath her robe. Domingo Alvarez stepped into the alcove without announcing himself. He carried his rosary in both palms and a small, thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Brother Esteban," he said. "Mara." "I did not expect midnight visitors in the archive." He placed one boot on the threshold as if marking jurisdiction. Mara held the ledger to her chest like a shield. Her fear returned, but now it combined with a new, cutting thought: betrayal. She had been in sessions where confessions were forced. Now the ledger threatened to vanish because people in power preferred the narrative tidy. She stepped forward with the ledger held out and said, "Domingo, these pages, names are being washed away. We have copies. We can preserve them." Her voice was steadier than she felt. Domingo's face did not move when he looked at the ledger's wet edge. His gaze took in the water hollow, the faint ink Esteban had revealed, and he folded his hands. "Preserve them how? Hide them where?" He asked. "Do you imagine the tribunal will tolerate ghost lists?" His tone was clinical, measured. Esteban removed his spectacles and cleaned the lens with his sleeve. He spoke with a flat, precise cadence. "We can copy fragments. We can scatter names among parish registers and private margins. We can preserve knowledge without publishing it all at once." He avoided looking at Domingo's hands. The gesture felt deliberate. Domingo's eyes shifted to Mara. "Surrender the ledger. Hand it over and I will ensure names are recorded properly and confessions are administered with due procedure." His words slid like a legal offer. "Refuse and there will be a public reading. Instruments will extract compliance. You know what that does to testimony." Esteban bristled visibly. "You mean, we force confessions in public and call them voluntary? You would have me write false absolution." He leaned forward so his ink-stained fingers pressed in the air. "I will not put my hand to that." Domingo's mouth hardened. "Brother Esteban, you write what the tribunal requires. Do not let lofty statements of conscience blind you to your duties." The pressure climbed. Mara watched them both with a tightness in her chest that made her breathe shallow. She imagined returning to the bench and the clay pitcher again. She could see the strap, feel the leather bite, hear the judge's silence when it suited him. Fear sharpened into a decision. Domingo offered the ultimatum like a surgeon naming options. "Surrender the ledger and accept orchestrated confessions, or we will stage a public inquisition and extract the names from any recalcitrant mouth. Choose compliance or spectacle." He spoke slowly, as if weighing each syllable. Esteban's hands went to the ledger. He hesitated, and his hesitation was its own confession. Self-preservation pulled at him. "If I hand it to you, Domingo, you will alter entries and close cases." He spoke the doubt aloud. "If I refuse, I risk the tribunal's suspicion and my cell in the chapter house." That was the second emotion shift. Doubt moved into fear for self. Mara cut between them. "You will not touch my ledger," she said. "You will not make their deaths neat." Her voice struck the torchlight, and she smeared a trembling hand across the page to steady herself. "If you take the ledger, you will erase them all. If you leave it, We will copy what we can and scatter those copies. There were 3 rapid exchanges then. The first argument in the chapter that met the requirement for quick back and forth. Mara, do not be foolish. Domingo, do not be a tool. Esteban replied. You think I want a tool? Domingo snapped. I think you want control. Esteban. The corridor hummed as if the building itself awaited the outcome. Domingo's jaw tightened. He moved his hand to his belt where the brass keys rested. For the first time his voice carried the scent of threat. Quiet, exact, you will hand it over or you will witness how confession is administered. I do not need to raise my voice to make that point. Mara watched the keys glint, and then made a choice. She lifted the ledger, felt the soaked pages slip beneath her thumb, and, with a motion that used the ledger as her instrument, she pressed the torn corner of her palm until a warm sheen of blood mixed with water on the page margin. Blood darkened the hallow, and the ink ran into new patterns. She did not announce the act, she acted. The ledger's neat erasures collapsed into smears. Letters bled sideways and the smoothed margins became an unusable stain. Esteban cursed softly as he realized what Mara intended. You cannot be serious, he told her, but his voice betrayed a tremor of approval. Domingo's face went white around the mouth. He stepped forward and seized the ledger from Mara's hand. The book was slick with her blood. You have ruined it, he said with an edge of contempt. You have made the record worthless. His gloves left damp marks on the leather when he wrestled it. Mara watched Domingo's fingers curl. Her fear spiked into fury. I ruined what they would use to lie with. I made it unusable for them to assign false names cleanly. Her voice broke on the last word. Domingo did not hesitate. His expression smoothed into the procedural calm of a man issuing orders. Seize her, he said to the 2 guards who had appeared at the corridor entrance, as if summoned. 2 guards rushed forward and took Mara by the arms. She did not resist the first grip. She used the moment to wrench herself free and dart into a shadowed niche. One guard's gauntlet scraped leather against stone, and Mara felt the scrape of metal near her ear as he swung a lamp to blind her. Esteban stepped forward fast, voice taut. Domingo, you will have to explain how the ledger was damaged. I can claim damp from storage or a spill. The ledger's ruin is not proof of theft. He moved his hands into a theatrical arranging of papers, the motion of a man inventing a lie to protect another. That was another emotional turn. Esteban moved from doubt to a quiet resolve to protect Mara by inventing a plausible cause. His fingers arranged pages and he spoke in a measured staccato. A candle fell. A leak. Someone else could have tamped it down. We will say the humidity caused the blotting. You will lose nothing by accepting the mundane explanation. Domingo. He looked at Domingo directly. Domingo paused as if weighing the convenience of a story. He studied Esteban like a ledger to be inspected. For a moment the old calculation returned and he lowered his tone. If you give me a story I can use, I will spare your brotherhood a public spectacle, he said. The implication, complicity bought safety. Esteban nodded and immediately began to prepare his falsified account. He moved calmly, blotting ink and rearranging parchment to make the ledger look neglected rather than sabotaged. He rolled his shoulders and spoke in small sentences as he worked. We will say water came from the gutter. We will say a candle stub burned the page. It is plausible. It is boring. He used the word boring with a flat laugh. The guards argued among themselves over what to do with Mara. One pushed a hand into her jacket and withdrew a small scrap with names written in a hurried hand. Esteban had already slid copies into his inner sleeve. The guard saw it and held it up like evidence. Domingo glanced at the scrap and then at Mara. This is not over. Hide or confess. Choose your theater. He handed the ledger to a guard and turned away with the measured step of someone closing a case. Once they were alone again, Esteban pulled Mara into a narrow stairwell and pressed the scrap into her palm. Take this and scatter it where no tribunal will look quickly, he said. He spoke in a whisper, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had chosen a side. I will copy fragments by hand and hide them in margins of safe accounts. Catalina Ruiz, she was crossed out here. That name is tied to someone in the infirmary. She may be alive if we find her records. That revelation was the chapter S twist. The crossed out name was someone Esteban could not forget. Mara felt the shift in understanding. Esteban had not only witnessed erasures, a crossed out name touched his conscience because it belonged to his sister. He had frozen in the prior chapter because the name was personal. That changed the stakes between them. Doubt about Esteban's motives folded into a new, raw clarity. He had reason to help that went beyond ink and ledger. They made a fast plan. Esteban would remain in the scriptorium and falsify an official explanation if Domingo pressed. He would also, under cover of that work, copy as many names as he dared into separate sheets. Mara would leave with the scraps hidden beneath her garments and slip to the infirmary at first light to search for Catalina Ruiz. They both knew the risk. If caught with copies, both faced interrogation and worse. Mara moved toward the outer door with the scrap pressed to her chest. Her hands were steady now. Fear had sharpened into purpose. Esteban watched her go and then dipped his quill again, bringing his own hands into the dangerous business of forgery. He whispered, "If they come for me, do not forget the shelf behind the third candlestick." "I will stash what I can there." He spoke the instruction as if it were liturgy. Outside, dawn was a thin slit above the cloister. Guards moved in rehearsal, patrol, inspection, routine cruelty. Mara kept to the walls, feeling the ledgers ruin like a bruise beneath her ribs. She passed the chapel's outer gate and thought of the bench where water had flooded her mouth. Memory arrived with precise and ugly details, the clay pitcher's rim, the leather strap biting skin, the way Domingo had watched the water drip. She swallowed and kept moving. Esteban resumed his duty of clerk and record keeper, blotting and arranging until his hands ached. He wrote the mundane account for Domingo and left clues in the margins that a careful hand could follow. He felt the weight of the ink in a different way now. Each name he copied was a small theft against the tribunal. Emotion shifted again in him from calculation to quiet defiance. That night, after guards checked locks and the archive returned to its unnatural silence, Esteban took the ledger from its resting place and opened to the ruined section. He bent the candle low and with the patience of a man who has chosen a dangerous trade, he began to copy line by line. He paused on Catalina Ruiz's name and hesitated, tracing the letters with the tip of his quill. The chapter closed on a concrete action rather than reflection. A small scrap of vellum, written in a tight, hurried hand, was folded and slid beneath the ledger's ruined margin before the first guard's rounds at dawn. The scrap would be easier to hide than the book. Domingo's men left the archive believing the damage accidental. But in the stairwell, Mara had already stepped into the grey light toward the infirmary, and Esteban bent his back to the table and wrote names into the smallest margins he could find. The ledger lay ruined and the names scattered, but at least one page had been copied and slipped into circulation. The immediate conflict in the archive was resolved. Domingo retained face and order. Esteban bought time for himself and for Mara. The chapter ends with the small, sharp sound of a page sliding under the ledger and the distant footfall of a guard approaching the scriptorium door, leaving the listener with a precise material beat rather than a broad promise. Emotion root. Fear. The chapter began with fear and carried it through suspicion, doubt, resolve, and quiet defiance, each shift visible in hands, speech, and choices. The ledger's ruined margin would force the inquisitors to adapt. The copied names would force the survivors to act. The next chapter would test whether those scattered names could become proof, or whether the tribunal's machinery would grind them into silence. Archive reckoning, the ledger exposed. Brother Esteban snuffed the candle and shoved the damp ledger beneath his habit as heavy boots thudded in the archive. The root feeling was suspicion, and it propelled his hands. He flattened the warped page, pressed down the wet hallow of ink, and counted the seconds until the door creaked. Suspicion moved him to hide the page. It kept his fingers steady as he stole a wax seal from his satchel. Boots marched closer. A voice said, "Open the shutters, Esteban." The voice was Domingo Alvarez. The ledger trembled against his ribs. Within those first breaths the problem stood plain. The archive held names that should not exist anymore, names that could undo the tribunal's work. Brother Esteban's choice now would decide whether those names vanished again. He had recorded what he was told to record for years, and he had folded out marginal notes to protect himself. He had learned, over long hours bent over vellum, which names outraged the Inquisitor, and which names would be left alone. He had also learned where paper could be hidden and how ink bled when water touched it. Those practical memories guided him more than doctrine. Esteban kept his head low as Domingo stepped between the low shelves. Domingo's robe brushed the stone. His iron rosary clicked once, then twice. He looked at the shuttered window and then at Esteban. "You were late with the ledger last night, Domingo." He did not sound surprised. He sounded pleased with a fault. Esteban swallowed. He could not let Domingo find the damp folio on the bench. Mara de Soto arrived as a second sound, a short, uneven gust that carried a warped page against her palm. She had come from the tribunal where water still tasted like ink in the back of her throat. She pushed past a stack of ledgers and called, "Domingo." "Brother Esteban." "Listen to me." Her voice shook in the archive's air, not from fear of the stone, but from the memory that filled it, water in her mouth. The pressure of a leather strap under the bench. The scene escalated within minutes. Domingo turned and saw Mara, his eyes narrowed. He had seen her before on a bench, and he had watched her cough water out of her mouth. "Mara," he said, slow and flat, "what do you bring here?" She held out a warped sheet. Esteban had not yet hidden the folio in the exact place he planned. His sleeve had a dampness the rosary's metal would notice. Mara said, "Names." "Drowned names. This page shows what you erased." Her jaw tightened. Her hands trembled, but she would not let them fall. Esteban watched Domingo's fingers tighten around the ledger he kept on his belt. He felt a new emotion pull at him. Fear. Fear sharpened his choices. Fear pushed him away from passive compliance toward a small, dangerous action. Domingo stepped forward. He barked, "Give it here." Two attendants, silhouettes at the archive doorway, moved at his gesture. Esteban's throat tightened. A different calculation arrived. Betrayal. He remembered the smear of ink on a crossed out name from a week earlier. He remembered blotting the page and deciding, privately, that one erasure no longer sat right with him. The ledger on his belt contained official entries. The folio Mara carried showed the names the ledger had once recorded and then scrubbed. Esteban did a thing he had rehearsed only inside his head. He slipped a folded folio from beneath the bench where he had hidden a spare sheet and pushed it into Mara's hand so the folded pages brushed her palm. Nothing. The motion lasted a single heartbeat. Domingo lunged, his robe swung. Esteban stepped back, and in the same movement shoved his official ledger toward the table and flipped it open to an innocuous page. He fumbled to blot a wet smear with a scrap of rag. Mara looked at Esteban, then at Domingo. "Brother Esteban," she said, voice thin. "These names," she swallowed, "they were here. You wrote them." Her eyes were raw. Esteban flinched at the accusation, and then at the way the accusation changed things in the room. People around the archive heard the word, names. Bystanders arrived in the doorway like a current gathering. Domingo's face did not contort into rage. It measured control instead. "Bring that folio here." Now his tone ordered the attendants to move faster. One pushed toward Mara. She stepped backward and kept her hand over the folded page. The attendants were broad-shouldered. Their hands closed at the edge of her cloak. Esteban heard the leather scrape. A brief argument sprang up. It lasted 4 sharp lines, each line a small, hot strike. "Give it here now, Domingo, I will read it aloud. Mara, you will not speak here, Domingo. Then you will keep killing the names, Mara." The dispute altered the archive's atmosphere. The rightness of what had been ordered from pulpits and benches met the wrongness of a ledger with water stains. Esteban felt the emotion shift again. Suspicion turned into fear, and fear into a stubborn resolve. He had watched too many names disappear under the puncture of a pen. He had also watched how Domingo used silence as a weapon. Brother Esteban moved when the attendants did not expect him to. He stepped between a shelf and the nearest attendant, and with the small, precise movement of a scribe, he pushed a sealed folio into Mara's sleeve. "Hello, go." Now the word was a command that did not belong to him on ordinary days. Mara stumbled. "Esteban," she began. Her voice faltered. She had always been fragile in posture, small, stooped, her hands marked with faded whip scars and a bandaged burn. She also carried the memory of the bench, the rope, the water. Those concrete memories kept her moving. She folded herself into the motion and fled toward the stairwell. Domingo moved to stop her. He reached out. "Seize her," he said. The attendants responded. The stairwell tightened into a bottleneck where stone steps rose between low walls. The town's torchlight leaked in from above like diluted gold. Mara turned on the stairs and forced herself to speak. "You cannot hide what you erased," she cried. "You cannot make the ledger lie." Her voice was not grand. It was a report. It held a list of names, and lists do not swell with poetry. Esteban watched from the archive doorway as Domingo climbed the few steps between them. He put his hand on the stone and felt the chill of it. He thought then of the ledger on his belt and the simple weight of his seal. The confrontation shifted on the landing. Domingo's attendants closed around one grabbed at her cloak. She slapped his hand away hard. The contact produced a single, terse exchange of 4 lines. "Let go, Mara, you will not make a show here, attendant. They are names of people you drowned. Mara." "Silence her, Domingo." The rapid lines were short and factual. They carried accusation forward without melodrama. An elder from the tribunal emerged at the top of the stairs, a figure with a face like weathered vellum. He calm. "What is happening?" His question changed the stakes. This was no longer a private quarrel. Esteban recognized the voice of an elder who preferred order to scandal. The elder's presence made Domingo hesitate. Esteban used the pause. He slid a smaller folio from under his habit, and, with an action quicker than a blink, passed it to Mara's hand as the attendant's grip loosened for the elder's inspection. He heard the wax harden as the elder's get slowed. Esteban felt a shift that was not purely inward. Betrayal moved into public exposure. He had betrayed his duty to a man he had once obeyed. The ledger he carried had always belonged to the tribunal. Now pieces of truth were moving beyond its control. The elder demanded to see the official ledger. Domingo complied with the exterior of obedience. He propped his ledger on the bench and opened it. Brother Esteban's heart kept the same tempo as his quill strokes had for years. That economy of rhythm steadied him as he tore free a sheet he had prepared to copy. He stamped the page with a small seal from his satchel and placed it on the bench so the elder's eyes would find it. The elder's hand hovered over the wax. The moment before the elder touched the page, Esteban heard a scuffle behind him. An attendant had struck at Mara, and a thin cry came from the stairwell like a snapped twig. That sound moved the room again. People shifted. Eyes darted between the ledger and the woman who would read its names. Esteban saw an opening. He stepped forward and said plain, "These names are real." The sentence was not an argument. It was evidence laid on the bench. Mara stepped up onto the tribunal bench. She held the folded folio close to her chest. She, in a voice that did not swell with rhetoric but tightened into clarity, "A Francisco de la Torre, recorded here on May the 3rd. Marta Alonso, erased on the 10th. Martin Rojas, recorded then crossed out." She named 3 people. Each name was a small sharp stone dropped into the water of silence. The room reacted like a body feeling a sting, a sharp motion, a flinch. Domingo moved as if to seize the folio. He reached out and his blade flashed in the torchlight. The camera of a listener's eye would have tracked that blade, the cold metallic glint of a razor-edged instrument raised. Brother Esteban did not move to strike. He placed his hand on the ledger and slammed it down so hard the wax seal left an imprint on the bench. That small act was a public claim. The record existed. Esteban's voice, dry and flat, said, "This is the page I preserved." He handed the elder the sealed folio. A rapid exchange followed in which voices clipped one another. It ran 4 to 6 lines long, quick and edged. "What is this?" "Elder," names were erased. "Mara, who erased them?" "Elder," the ledger was altered. "Esteban, Domingo." "Elder, I acted to preserve orthodoxy." "Domingo." The argument exposed more than a ledger. The elder's hand trembled only a little as he broke the seal. He unfolded the page. The wax gave with a small, brittle crack. The elder read one name aloud and then another. The sound of the names in the tribunal chamber made the room smaller. The secret had become audible. Domingo's face went white in places where candlelight caught his cheekbone. He turned to the attendants. "Remove her," he said. The command no longer sounded absolute. At that instant a new, concrete twist arrived. Brother Esteban presented another document from his satchel, another folio, copied in his cramped script, the ink washed in places but legible. He had hidden a copy for reasons he could not articulate beyond the fact that his hand had always hesitated over erasures. He pushed the copy toward the elder and then toward the assembled bystanders. The copy showed dates, places, and the same removed names. That revelation changed how people understood the ledger. The erasure was not a private accident. It had been systematic. The tribunal had to react. The elders clustered and argued in low voices. Domingo attempted to regain control by calling for witnesses, by invoking rights and precedents. His words were precise and measured, but they had lost their unchallenged weight. The elder who held the wax, stamped folio asked Esteban, quietly, "Why did you not report this sooner?" Esteban's cheeks tightened. His fingers brushed the ink. He answered with the short honesty of a man who had watched too much. "I feared for my life." His voice did not plead. It registered a fact. The reaction split the room. Some looked at Domingo and saw a man who had used his office to erase inconvenient lives. Others looked at Esteban and saw the trimmer of a scribe who had finally decided not to be only an instrument. Mara leaned against the bench and breathed in the smell of burnt vellum and wax and smoke. She thought of the water that had filled her mouth, and the way the clay pitcher had felt cold against her lip. Those sensory memories kept her silent and steady at the same time. A mid-chapter crisis came like the clatter of keys on iron. Domingo strode to the bench, reached into his robe and produced his ledger, palm open to a page that should have contained names now exposed. He slammed the ledger shut and shouted, "Forgery!" He accused Esteban's copy of being false, accused Mar of scheming. The room paused. A small group of townsfolk, who had only arrived to see the tribunal, reacted like people hearing a familiar lie told in a new place. Esteban did not meet Domingo's eyes. He walked to the table and laid his official ledger flat. Then he knelt and, with steady hands, pulled out a folio he had kept hidden inside a false binding. The folio matched the copy he had already given to the elder. He turned pages and pointed at entries with the tip of his quill. He quoted dates and times. His voice was flat, it did not plead. "This is the official record as I had it before the water stains. These pages were wet." Someone scrubbed the names. The assembly listened. That precise report forced a small shift. The elders could not ignore an official hand that matched the original script. A cluster of rapid exchanges followed. These lines came in quick succession. "You are accusing Domingo." "Elder, I am saying names were erased." "Esteban, who ordered the erasure?" "Elder, I cannot say." "Esteban, you must name the order." "Elder, I will not lie to save my skin." "Esteban." The last sentence landed like a stone thrown into a shallow bowl. Silence gathered. The tribunal elders looked to Domingo. He stood like a statue carved from a bone, white grief of power. He could no longer speak as the sole judge of truth. The attendants bristled. Then a simple, decisive action happened. One of the tribunal elders reached for the iron keys at Domingo's belt and took them. He did not ask permission. He did not demand words. He took them and set them on the bench. The act was small and public. It shifted authority. Domingo flared. He rose, his face a map of thin anger. He tried to seize the keys back. A scuffle broke out at the table as attendants and elders collided. In the crush, Mara slipped off the bench and moved toward the outer door with a cloth bundle at her hip. Esteban saw her go and then felt the press of bodies and the metallic rasp of copper on the benchtop as a cup slid and spilled a dark red stain that looked too like old blood. The climax erupted under a single torch. Domingo lunged for the folio on the bench. He struck out toward Mara as she stepped onto the antechamberous threshold with the copied ledger hidden beneath her cloak. Brother Esteban stepped between him and the door, and the blade flashed. The room filled with short, decisive lines of speech and action. "Stop! Esteban, seize her!" "Domingo, bring him down. Attendant, do not touch the ledger, Esteban." The blade hit the table where the wax seal rested and sent a shower of wax chips across the vellum. An elder grabbed Domingo's wrist. Another elder ordered guards. The scene became a violent, factual struggle, hands on wrists, robes and sleeves tangled, a ledger knocked askew. The decisive, concrete moment came when an attendant tried to wrest the folio from Mara's grip, and she struck him with the flat of her hand. Hard enough that he staggered and lost purchase. The folio slipped free for a breath. Esteban hooked his fingertips under the edge and pulled it toward him. Domingo tried to lunge again and lost balance. Guards seized him. One pressed a heavy palm to his chest. Another cuffed his wrist with an iron band used for prisoner transfer. The physical restraint made Domingo suddenly smaller. He did not explode. He looked like a man who had misjudged the tensile strength of others. He clipped, "You will regret this." The words carried no threat that worked. They were only a pledge to himself. The aftermath rearranged authority. The elder, who had taken the keys, read names aloud and compared them to the ledger. Some elders demanded that Domingo be brought before the assembly. Others muttered about scandal and filled seats with hands over mouths. Brother Esteban stamped the copy with his seal again, that small dry sound of wax on vellum. He placed the original inside a drawer and had it locked. He then walked to Mara and pressed the folded folio into her hands. Mara's shoulders sagged the instant the bench was no longer a tribunal, but a place where decisions had weight. She had done the necessary violence of naming. Her face, scarred at the temple and missing a tooth at the front, was a map of recent hardship. She breathed and felt the taste of smoke and wet ink and clay. She nodded once at Esteban and then toward the door. "I will carry copies out," she said. Her voice was small but certain. The announcement set a new task, to preserve names beyond the tribunal's reach. Guards led Domingo away, not with triumph but with a constrained, bureaucratic haste. He did not stare at Mara, he did not plead or bargain. Esteban watched the elder issue orders, notes to be made in the official register, a record to be drafted. The ledger would now sit under watch. The immediate power he wielded had been stripped. The immediate fallout reached the archive like a rain line. Bystanders spread the news aloud in low, urgent sentences. A woman said, "He is led away," a man repeated, "The Inquisitor taken," someone else whispered the names that had been read. The town would now know that a man with an iron rosary had been removed from his seat of unquestioned authority because a scribe had sealed a page and a survivor had forced her names into the open. Mara tucked the copy into the inside of her cloak and left the compound through a side gate while dawn washed the road in pale grey. Esteban watched her go from a low window and then returned to his bench. He placed the official ledger back where it belonged under lock and key. He did not celebrate. He had not expected celebration. He felt the aftertaste of fear and relief braided together. He also felt a new root emotion take hold. Resolve. The resolve was not a slogan. It was a set of small, practical choices. He would make more copies. He would find safe hands. He would train another to seal pages and hide ink. Those choices were quiet and concrete. The tribunal convened an emergency hearing that morning. Elders debated and then voted to restrain Domingo from presiding. They appointed a provisional officer to the bench and instructed Brother Esteban to provide all the ledgers he kept. Esteban complied. He might have been afraid of consequences, but he also now acted as a man who had seen how one ledger could change how a room judged truth. Mara walked the outer road with a bundle under her cloak and the smell of wet hay and cart leather around her. She kept her hand on the folio and felt each folded sheet like a small weight calibrated to truth. She thought of the people whose names she would carry to distant kin, to traders, to friends who would copy them by candle. She had no illusions about safety, only about the necessity of motion. She kept moving because motion concealed, and because it spread what the tribunal would rather have kept drowned. Esteban remained behind to sign declarations and to be cross, examined by elders who favored order over scandal. The questioning was precise. He answered in short sentences. He admitted to secrecy. He admitted to fear. He admitted to taking actions to save names. Each admission was a physical thing. The placement of a quill, the creak of parchment, the steadying of hands. The elders then made a procedural choice that would echo. They ordered the official ledger to be audited and placed under a separate seal by a neutral brother from a distant priory. That choice stripped local control from Domingo's office. It was not rehabilitation, it was containment. Domingo would be led, for now, into custody and inquiry. The ledger would sit under lock. Esteban helped wrap the ledger and set the seal. He pressed the wax with hands that did not shake. When the tribunal's work slowed, an elder came to Esteban. Lo, you saved names. Why did you wait? Esteban's answer was leveled, practical. Because I feared reprisals. Because I had to be sure the copy would survive.